Okay, hello, welcome to our Parsha Shiur. This week's Parsha is Parshat Korach, such an interesting Parsha. I was very curious to see how she treated it, and there were many very good essays. One fun fact while I pull up our screen, I have been using this online digital copy, which is amazing to prepare, but they somehow mixed up two pages. It was very confusing, and I was almost going to have to abandon this essay, but I liked it so much that I called Rav Hodi. I want to give Rav Hodi Hakarat Hatov. He went into the library and took the physical book and made a copy of the page that had somehow gotten flipped with the next chapter. And so we could do the whole thing because I really had gotten quite attached to the subject. So I think it's a good one, and we will hop in. So almost all of the essays on this parsha were on the subject of Korach and the mutiny, as she calls it. But I thought that this particular idea of what is the role of Bnei Israel within this broader story was very interesting, right? Generally, we think about Korach and his followers and Datan and Aviram, and we think about Moshe and Aaron and Hashem maybe, right, as like the two sides of the debate. And the question of where Bnei Israel is, are they sort of in the middle, like ping-ponging back and forth as they watch the debate happen? Do they join one side or the other? Is really interesting. And I think it's interesting, especially at this moment where we all are in some ways watching these big mutinies and big decisions get made, and sort of where we stand and how we align ourselves, I think is a really interesting question. Okay. So this is the third of her essays. So in the previous chapter, she discussed what was bothering Korach. And now we're going to look at one passage in the story, which is simple in its wording, but difficult to understand. In the first half of the chapter, the struggle involves Moshe on the one hand and Korach and his congregation on the other. And the whole of this congregation airs its views. So this is not all of Bnei Israel, but all of Korach's followers. And it says, right, Rab lachem kichol ha'eda kulam kedoshim, right? You have gone too far, Moshe and Aaron. All of this community is holy. Uvetocham Hashem, and God is in their midst. Umadua tit nasu al kahal Hashem. Why then do you raise yourselves above God's congregation? Right? That's the argument, right? That we are all holy, but somehow Moshe and Aaron seem to be above everyone else. Moshe replied, oops, this must be a typo, harangued, reproved, strove to placate them. Right? Moshe argued with them. They retorted, Datan and Aviram, with greater impudence than the rest, till Moshe made his final proposition regarding the fire pans for the morrow. Where were the rest of the Israelites? On whose side did they arrange themselves? But it does say range in the text. Were they swept along in the murky current of the malcontents, joining Korach's hand? Or did they remain loyal to Moshe, their teacher and prophet? The text has hitherto paid no attention to them. Right? So Bnei Israel, it's just unclear where this mass of people is in relation to the argument between Korach, Datan, and Aviram on one side and Moshe on the other. Right. And I think it's interesting that God has sort of gotten lost in this showdown, right? It's Moshe versus Korach, basically. And the question is, where do Bnei Israel align themselves? And so Nechama Leibowitz tells us in verse 19, we do have an allusion to an attempt by Korach to influence them, i.e. Bnei Israel, to join forces with him, Korach. Vayakal alehem Korach et kol ha'eda el petach ohel moed. Right? So Korach has gathered everyone to the tent of meeting, to the ohel moed. And she brings us Rashi here, where he says, what does it mean that Korach gathered them or convened them? B'divrei leitzanut, by scoffing language. Kol halayla halach etzel hashvatim ufita ota. All night, Korach was campaigning. He was knocking on doors and shaking hands. And he was trying to win over the Shvatim. And he would say, Kisvurin atem sha'alai levadi ani makpid? Do you really think I care for myself alone? makpid ela bishvil kulchem, right? I only care about you guys. Elu ba'in v'notzlin kol hagedulot, lo hamalchut la'achliv hakuna, ad sheniftachu kulam. These men, Moshe and Aaron, come and occupy every high office, royal rank for himself, for his brother, the priesthood, until in the end, all of them submitted to his persuasion. So Rashi, it seems, is imagining that the fight between Moshe and Korach has Bnei Israel standing in the middle, but Korach goes to the trouble of knocking on doors and campaigning for himself, and he wins over the people to come and stand at the Ohel Moed with him. Right, so he's done a good job of rallying the crowd, but we are still uninformed as to the extent of their acceptance of Korach's point of view. Right, as with any campaign, things are reduced to these very small, sort of pithy phrases. And so she asks, did they merely agree to come to the tent of meeting and watch the proceedings to see how things would work out, or did they actually share his views? Perhaps subsequent verses will clarify matters. Vayakal alehem Korach kol ha'eda al petach ohel moed. Right, that's what we just read above. Korach gathers everyone together. Vayera kavod Hashem el kol ha'eda, and then the presence of God appeared to the whole community. The rudeness of this divine revelation portrayed God's indignation. Let us study the content of the message accompanying the divine revelation. So she says, right, that when all of the people come together with Korach in front of the Ohel Moed, God appears. And the way that Nechama Leibowitz understands the pasuk is that the way that God appears so suddenly is like God like huffs into the picture. His indignation is clear. And that what does God say? V'yadaber Hashem al Moshe v'Aaron lemor. God speaks to Moshe and Aaron. Hibadlu mitoch ha'edah hazot v'achla otam keraga. Stand back from this community that I may annihilate them in an instant. Okay, this is a strong phrase, right? So Korach and Moshe and all of their sort of seconds are in front of the Ohel Moed, and Korach has managed to bring the bulk of the people there too. And God says, Kol ha'edah hazot, it seems like maybe we're to understand that this might be the whole of Bnei Israel. But she says, right, first of all, who is this congregation? Is this just Korach's people? Is this everybody? Who were faced with the threat of retributive extinction? Our commentators differ. Nachmanides cited the view of Rabbeinu Hananel only to repudiate it, prefacing first another question. Okay, so the Ramban, Nachmanides, brings the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel is a very old commentary. I don't think we've found him yet. Hold on, I brought him here for us. He is from Morocco, lives in the late 900s, early next century, rabbi and a Talmudist, Rosh Yeshiva. It's possible that his family was from Italy, and he maintains a lively correspondence with the heads of the great yeshivot in Babylonia. And then just to remind us, Nachmanides, the Ramban, lives in the 1100s, so about 100 or so years later in Spain and in Israel. So no overlap, but the Ramban had learned Rabbeinu Hananel, and he brings him in order to disagree with him. Okay, so here we are. So what does the Ramban says? He says, Yesh lish'ol, there might be someone who might ask, Im Yisrael lo chatu v'lo mardu b'rabam, lama haya haketzaf alehem lemor v'achala otam karaga. He's saying the punishment doesn't seem to match up with the crime. If all of the people didn't rebel and sin, then why was God going to consume them? And v'im gam hem mardu Korach v'ka'adato, if they did end up joining Korach was convincing, ech yomru Moshe v'Aaron ha'ish echad yachatev et kol ha'edati sof. Right, when Moshe defends them, he says, it can't be both. Either all of Bnei Israel sins or just Korach sins. And if all of Bnei Israel sins, maybe they should be annihilated. But why does Moshe say it's really just Korach? So that's the question. Rabbeinu Hananel says, Adat Korach v'lo adat Bnei Israel. So Rabbeinu Hananel is saying, no. The Eidah that is going to get eaten by God is just Korach's followers, not all of Bnei Israel. But Moshe and Aaron thought, like they misunderstood, and they thought that God was talking about everybody. It's a confusing kol ha'edah, right? If you said, "Oh, everyone is going to be eaten by fire," you say, "Well, which everyone? Korach's everyone or everyone?" Um, and so Moshe tries to defend the everyone, the bigger Edah. And immediately God informed Moshe that he didn't want to destroy everyone, right? God had to explain, to clarify. And therefore, when God says, right, lefichach perash lo, he explains to him, Zesha amarti hibadlu, when I said, separate yourselves, he'alu misaviv l'mishkan, Korach v'Datan v'Aviram, I meant go away from Korach, Datan, and Aviram, because they were the ones who were going to be eaten up. So according to this interpretation, Korach only succeeded in winning over his immediate followers, his congregation, whereas Moshe had misunderstood the divine threat to refer to the whole people. The second message of God in verse 24 is a clarification of the first one. The Shadal, another favorite commentary of Nechama Leibowitz's, takes a similar attitude. The congregation referred to by God were the incense offerers, whom God did not wish Aaron to join because they would not wait for the morrow, for tomorrow. Moshe, on the other hand, had thought that God had meant to involve the whole of the major part of the people. Okay, so this is the opinion that, remember, the Ramban is holding up just to tear down, right? So the first idea is, what does Kol Ha'edah means? It just means Korach's Edah. Moshe misunderstood, God clarifies, and we can move on. But besides the difficulty of attributing to Moshe such a mistake in understanding the prophetic message, Nachmanides objects to Rabbi Hananel's interpretation on other grounds. So that's a fair point, right? Moshe is the great prophet. How could he have so vastly misunderstood God's message? But not only that, but the Ramban will have another point here. The Ramban is a long-winded commentary, so we're just going to jump around a little bit here. Okay. Besides, the expression separate yourselves, right? Hibadlu, alludes only to Moshe and Aaron, right? The Ramban saying grammatically, this doesn't work in the sentence. Hibadlu is God saying, Moshe and Aaron, get you two up from among the Edah. Similarly, that I may consume them, right? Va'achle otam karaga, remez l'magefa shetachala am rav v'atzum karaga. It refers to a plague which consumes a mighty and large people. It can't just be Korach, Datan, and Aviram, which, by the way, we also know that Korach gets swallowed up. But he's saying Ka'achla Karaga seems to imply a much bigger audience than the 3 or even 100 people who are 250 people who are following Korach. It must have referred to a larger group. And finally, right, it does, v'chalila, God forbid, shelo yavin Moshe nevuato v'yit'eba, that how could we possibly say that Moshe didn't understand? So, according to the Ramban, he is going to tell us, aval hata'am, the meaning is as follows, ki mitchila haya lev ha'am achrei Moshe v'Aharon. At first, the heart of the people was on the side of Moshe and Aaron. But when Korach and his people came and took every person his ketoret, right? V'amdu petach ohel, mo'edi Moshe v'Aaron, az kara Korach l'chol ha'edah, v'amar lahem ki bichvod kulam hu mekaneh, right? Korach says he was concerned about all of their honor when he protested or mutinized. V'yitav hadavar be'enehem. And the people thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense. V'nikalu kulam lirot ulai yishar be'enei ha'elokim. Right, they're taken by Korach's argument, and they think maybe God will also be taken with their argument. And here you can sort of understand, right, when someone makes a compelling argument and you look to the person in charge, right? I see it with my kids when they're bargaining for dessert, right? If one of them says, well, we didn't have dessert last night, all the kids are like, ooh, that makes sense. What do you think, Mom? Right? And they swivel back to them. And so it's interesting to think of Bnei Israel as standing there trying to make sense of the news, right? Trying to make sense of what's going on, which I think is something that feels very pertinent today, right? You look at like 4 different news sources and you're like, oh, that makes sense. No, that makes sense. And so the idea that Bnei Israel is sort of taken with Korach's argument and then looks to see if it will be right, I think is very relatable, but is also very, very bad. Because, right, it v'tashuva v'zeh ta'am be'akal alehem Korach et kol ha'eda. Right, this is what it means to say that Korach assembled all of them. V'hinei nitchayvu kelaya shahayu meharim acharei rabam. They all became liable to destruction because they cast aspersions on their teacher. V'hem kemeharim acharei hashchina, which is like casting aspersions on God. That by buying into Korach's argument, even for a moment, it is as though they stood on Korach's side. Right? And so then when Moshe and Aaron are defending the people, they're saying, Shelo chatab ma'aseh ela Korach. Korach is the real sinner here because hu hagorem v'hu hamafteh otam. Right? He was the cause and the inciter. Right? I think it's just a fascinating argument about at what point we assume liability or responsibility for something that's happening. How tacitly or explicitly do you have to agree with someone or support their cause, right? What if people gave Korach money for his campaign? What if they formed a pact, right? What if they signed a letter? What if they just stood there with Korach? At what point, this seems to be what Moshe and Hashem are arguing about, does the inciter and the causer take the responsibility? And at what point does everyone assume some liability? Okay. So I think it's a super interesting question and like tension that Nachmanides is teasing out here. Right, so Nachmanides is going to help us sort of paraphrase a little. According to Nachmanides, the Almighty had meant to consume the whole congregation, right? So the Ramban, opposite Shadal, Luzato, and Rabbeinu Hananel is saying it's not just the Eidah of Korach, it's the Eidah of all of Bnei Israel. But Moshe was able to calm them down. But Moshe's intercession raises another problem alluded to by Isaac Arama in his Akedah Yitzchak. So here, right, by Moshe interceding, he causes another problem, and this is what that Akedah Yitzchak is talking about. He says, "Shall one man sin, and will you be wroth with all the congregation?" Right? That's what Moshe says to God. What was unusual in this? Surely not all of them had sinned. Oh, sorry, all of them had sinned with the calf. Yet it is stated, "Leave me, and let my anger be kindled against them, that I may consume them." Right. So his first point is, well, wait a second, not everyone participated in the Egel Hazahav, and yet they were all collectively punished for that one, and Moshe didn't get upset. And then he brings a fascinating story about a person named Achan in Yehoshua, where Achan did this terrible thing, and he took from that which was cherem, which was like dedicated and set aside for God. And when he did that, the wrath fell upon all of the congregation of Israel. Basically, Hashem sent the people of Ai to ambush Bnei Israel because of Achan's crime. Right, so Achan did this terrible thing or greedy thing where he took something that really was not for him, and as a result, many people died in a battle in Ai. Sort of unrelated punishment and crime, as far as I can tell. It's a really good example, right? Korach did this thing. And so the Akedah Yitzchak is saying, well, Korach did it, but we have other precedent for one person's crime or some people's crime affecting the whole of Israel. The individual is a part of the whole, just as the whole man is sick, even when only one part of the body is affected, right? And this is not what the Akedah Yitzchak is saying, but it is what I have been thinking about today and yesterday while I was learning this, which is to say, like, who produced Korach? Korach didn't just like step out of a vacuum. The community bears responsibility for its people that are sick or that make bad choices, because the community is the thing that produces each individual person on some level. I don't know exactly what to like do with that at this moment, but I think that there's something powerful about that for sure. Which is to say, Korach, first of all, could have been what's it called, like the canary in the coal mine. Like the first one to start mutannizing, but everyone was close behind. Or maybe he was the only one sort of brave enough to do it, but everyone was thinking it or agreeing with him. Or maybe we created a situation in which there was a Korach. And Moshe and Aaron and Hashem are not the only ones to bear responsibility. We are all one. The individual is a part of the whole. Okay, so the Arama, oh, and sorry, this I think also should have been bumped in a little bit, but the Arama explains the connection between verse 22, Moshe's intercession, and verse 23, the divine answer. Divine anger is directed against the community for the sin of the individual, as in Achan's case, when the individual is knit to his group and is identified with it. In such a case, we blame the community for having not warned him or disassociated itself from his acts. Further, if the community is all of one mind, it is more likely they will be influenced by the misdeeds of the guilty person. They are indeed like the body which is affected by the sickness of one of its limbs. It quickly spreads further. The commentary of Chaim Joseph Falk. But when the sinner has separated himself from the community and taken himself to one side to take issue with them, the burden of sin is already removed from them. Right? If you become like the Unabomber or whatever, right, and you sort of isolate yourself from everybody else, then you've gone further. But I think the very idea that Korach felt he could knock on everyone's tent door that night and try to amass people behind him means that he was not so far removed, right? I think that's maybe the understanding. When someone is so far removed, we no longer hold the public guilty for the misdeed of the individual. It's like a limb that has been severed from the living body, having no further connection with it. So we now can understand Moshe's plea, right? Should one man sin and God will be angry with all of the congregation? Because according to the Arama, the Korach did not succeed in winning over all the Israelites. On the contrary, he separated himself from the congregation to dispute with Moshe. As Rashi explains, and this is a beautiful explanation of the first words of our Parsha, Vayikach Korach. What does it mean that Korach took? And I should have brought the pasuk because there must be a plainer meaning, but Rashi is saying, oh, Korach took himself. He took himself away. And so God rightly demanded that just in Korach and his band had separated themselves from the rest of the congregation, so should the congregation actively separate and disassociate themselves from Korach. So again, I think this question of like at what point is the amputation complete? At what point do we bear some guilt for the person who has done something wrong as part of a community is like a beautiful question, right? Kol Yisrael Arivim Ze Bazeh kind of question. Let's keep going. And then this was a long essay. Let's keep going a little bit and then we can think about some of the answers here. But before we keep going, I want to introduce Ibn Attar, I think another new commentary for us. I had to look him up. Ibn Attar is, let's find him here, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, known as the Or HaChaim, which is the name of his work. Also North African, but much, much later, really late 1600s, mostly 1700s. He was a Kabbalist also. He left Morocco to make Aliyah, but on the way, and I don't really understand the way that people moved back then because I wouldn't really say Italy is on the way to Israel from Morocco, but maybe my geography is a little bit rusty. But however he went, he passed through Italy and the people convinced him to stay and he founded a yeshiva and his works were printed. It's such an interesting idea to me. He stumbled
Yael,
Yael. Yeah.
All right, so until the Abraham Accords, the only way to get from Israel to Morocco was through Europe.
There we go. I knew someone would know the answer if I mentioned my four letters.
So now with the Abraham Accords, you can go directly Israel to Morocco. But until the Abraham Accords, like a few years ago, there were no direct flights. You had to go through Europe. So we were on a trip to Morocco with AACI from Israel. They had to go through Europe to get to Morocco.
Interesting. Okay, so it must have been the same in the 1700s. And he had to go through Italy. It's like a shame you're so close. It's almost like the 40 years in the desert. But he ended up staying for quite a long time, but he eventually did make Aliyah to Israel. His student was the Chida, a rather famous scholar, and his Torah commentary, the Orach Chaim, is a blend of Kabbalistic teachings with deeply insightful and original readings, and he was held in very high esteem by the early Hasidim. Okay, so I had never heard of him, and now we also know something about how you.
Excuse me, Rabbanit.
Oh, yeah, please, Rabbi Schwartz.
No, just want to say, I mean, that's the famous thing, or Chaim HaKadosh, that the Baal Shem Tov wanted to get to Eretz Yisrael, and that they would meet, and potentially they would have been able to bring Mashiach had the Baal Shem Tov made it to Israel, but he never ended up getting there.
Oh, interesting. And that, I think that that is one, right? That's one of the Mashiach Sudas sort of foundational stories.
Right, that
Yeah,
revolves around the Baal Shem Tov and the trip to Eretz Yisrael,
that's
and he
right.
got stuck in Istanbul on over
Yeah,
Pesach and so on. Yeah.
it's a wild story. I love the Mashiach Suda. Cool. Thank you. Um, okay, so the Ibn Attar asks us almost like a more practical question that has such a deep spiritual echo, right? He says, why should the Israelites merit instant destruction, even if they happen to be standing among Korach's band? Right? Aaron was with them. He was unharmed. Like if this is divine punishment, God can't narrow his God's focus, to get the people who aren't sinning and not the people who aren't sinning. You would think that he would have more precision, right? What was the purpose then of the divine demand to separate themselves and get away physically from the vicinity of Korach? But as the Arama has emphasized, Malbim likewise points out, they were bidden to perform a public act of dissociation from Korach's acts. God answered him, this is the Malbim speaking, that his wrath was caused by the fact that their standing near the wicked implied that they condoned their actions. They had to show by keeping away that they did not share their views. And this reminds me like a little bit, Lahavdil a million times over, of like not eating at Ben and Jerry's. Right? Like if we think that our not eating at Ben and Jerry's really impacted their bottom line of Unilever, I'm not so sure. Right. But I think that in some small way, we were saying we don't want to be seen there, right? We don't want to be seen with someone who speaks that way about the boundaries of Israel, or maybe I've waded into a political. This was not my plan to mention Ben and Jerry's, but I think that the idea of
And converted to Christianity.
right. That's I did not that is not that was not my point, but yes, that is true. I think what I was trying to say is that sometimes when we don't want to be associated with someone, there's a that's very powerful. Right? A boycott is not just about forcing them to change their mind because of their bottom financial line, but about saying this is important to me. And that like sort of voting with your feet is very powerful. And I think that was sort of what caught me at this moment also, right? So many people have been going to stand somewhere, right? A lot of protests and rallies, the running for their lives people, right? Everyone is sort of saying, I'm going to stand with my values. And I want it to be really clear that I'm not standing with someone else who doesn't share those values. And I think it's just very true, right? It was true for the Malbim, it was true for the Ibn Attar, it's true today, that when we stand near someone, we may imply that we condone their actions. And what role do we have in not allowing that to be misunderstood? I think that for me, that's the question, right? Is at what point do you actually have to physically move your chair or your seat or your spot or whatever it is to show that you're not involved before God feels like you're guilty too, right? It seems like, at least according to the Ramban, perhaps like, God really felt that everyone was guilty if they didn't move themselves away. Okay, according to the foregoing commentators, the Israelites were in the dangerous situation characteristic to many people to this day, right? In the 1940s, in the 1600s, in 2025. They neither agreed with Korach nor actively opposed him, but stood aside to see how things would work out. And so not only do we talk about Achan, but now we also talk about Haran, Abraham's brother, the archetype of the opportunist. There's something about this that feels sort of unfair. It feels unfair with Bnei Israel and with casting Haran as the opportunist. Right. The story of Haran is that when Nimrod was trying to punish Abraham by throwing him in the fiery furnace, Haran was standing there too, is the idea. And he, instead of saying, I believe in Hashem, he said, well, let me see what happens to Abraham. So Abraham gets thrown in the fiery furnace and then comes out unscathed. And so Haran thinks, oh, well, I guess I could do it too. But because he was not standing up for God, it doesn't work out as well for him. He is killed in the fiery furnace. I don't know that that's necessarily opportunistic. Maybe I'm being too kind to the bystander. I think like on some level it's trying to make sense of the world, but I don't know. But certainly there is something about sort of sitting quietly, silence and sort of presence could be misunderstood. The Almighty therefore demanded that the congregation get up from the dwelling of Korach, Datan, and Aviram. But again, the question arises, why did Moshe, the faithful mediator between God and Israel, not transmit the divine order in exactly the same words as he had received it? Right? So God says he badlu, to get up and move away. And what Moshe says is Suru na me'al ahale ha'anashim harsha'im ha'eleh. Move away from the tents of these wicked people. Va'al tigu b'chol asher lahem. Don't touch their things. Pen tisafu b'chol chatotam. Right? Moshe is making it really clear. Get out of here. Right? The Al-Shich suggests that Moshe's substitution of the phrase suruna for ha'alu, get you up, implied a softening of the divine order. He tried to persuade them for their own good in order to placate them. And so you can imagine him saying, right, I'm not asking you to get away from them completely, just to move a little bit. The succeeding verse states they got them up, implying that they left unwillingly, as if they had been forced to leave, shamed by Moshe. For this reason, Moshe had himself gone to the place and stood by Korach and Datan and Abiram to make sure they would be shamed into moving, and did not communicate the divine message through an intermediary. So it seems like the people were not sure that they wanted to leave, and Moshe understood that he had to sort of gently push them along. On the other hand, another commentator, and I don't know who it is. It's interesting that she doesn't cite who it is, gives the very opposite explanation. Ha'alu implies merely to move away a little, whereas Moshe, who understood the divine intention, gave it greater force by telling them to turn away completely, both physically and spiritually, from all connected with Korach and his evil doctrines. The Israelites, however, content themselves with moving away physically from the place from fear of the immediate consequences, but inwardly did not repudiate Korach's evil path and the material greed symbolized by it. In proof of this, we may cite what happened immediately after the miracle and dreadful punishment meted out to Korach. Right, so after the ground swallows up Korach, it says, "Vayilonu kol ha'adat b'nei Yisrael mimacharat al Moshe v'al Aharon lemor atem hamitem et am Hashem." That the Bnei Israel, it seems like, have not learned the lesson, right? That they get upset with Moshe and Aaron for having brought death upon God's people. So this other commentator is saying, well, how much did they really separate themselves from Korach at the end of the day? Okay, so I think to bring it all back together, she brought a wide array of sources to try to tease out the question of at what point Bnei Israel would have been liable to have been eaten up by the plague, right? When they come out to hear Korach's argument at the Petach Ohel Moed, is their silence and proximity to Korach enough to have them be in trouble? Did they really believe Korach, or were they just sort of waiting to see who God chose instead of having faith in Moshe that God would choose Moshe? And then at what point do they have an obligation to get up and separate themselves much more from Korach than they had before? And I think that it's hard, and it was hard for Bnei Israel, and Moshe saw that, and it's hard for us today. But I think we often think about the Korach story in terms of holiness and factions, and this is just a different and I think really powerful element to that story that I thought was interesting. I am going to stop sharing and talking, and would love to hear what other people have to say.
Yes, first of all. Lots of sources.
Yeah, amazing array of sources. And it's interesting, right? Sometimes she brings two sources, like the Ibn Ezra and Rashi, and that's it throughout the whole thing. And sometimes she brings this really amazing array. And when you think about when she was writing, she must have had an amazing library, right? And she was able to pull the books off the shelf. There was no Sefaria, there was no, right? And so all of these sources that were unknown, right? Certainly the Ibn Attar, I think was not a well-known source at that time, and it was not on the page of your Chumash. It's really amazing exposure.
Couple quick things, with your permission.
Please.
Okay, so this Motzei Shabbos, I was learning a piece of Kedusha Levi, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditcha, and he brings a pasuk, he brings a verse, etc., and basically he says l'chafschut to of this in character of him of Korach. What did Korach want? Korach wanted to be a Kohen. He wanted to be the Kohen because Kohen is associated with the concept of Chesed, and he wanted a world of Chesed. And Hashem said, no, the world is not a world of Chesed. The world is Chesed and Zerah, Chesed and Din. And that's why it didn't work. Number two, the whole world says that the Yismach Moshe, Satmar Rebbe's great-grandfather, said that in another lifetime, in another Gilgul, he was there at the time in the argument and the fight between Moshe and Korach, and he said it was a very, very difficult fight to decide whose side you were on. And when
That's interesting, right? I like never thought about it. The people. I assumed that they were sort of innocent bystanders, but it seems like they really were making a decision.
And when the Orach Chaim HaKadosh died, the Baal Shem Tov's candles went out on Shabbos, and he intuitively knew that the Orach Chaim was gone.
Wow.
And on a happier note, it seems like for the Jewish people, Hashem has shown that chesed over these past days.
I would suggest that also, I think I don't know who taught me this, but if you go later on in Tanakh, sometimes you find the answer to some of these questions. So we ask the questions about should the people have been punished more or less or whatever. But if you look at Eliyahu Hanavi, when he has the contest with the priest of Baal, and he sort of mocks the people. He says, "Will you stand al shnei sipim?" At the same, so will you stand on both sides, so to speak, and not take a side here between me, that is, either take a side with me or take a side with the priest of Baal. So it seems like you, the people, are waiting to see what the results are. Will I get God to take the sacrifice, burn the sacrifice, or will the priest of Baal, so to speak, get away from this, and maybe be able to succeed and keep the people on their side?
I love that. Rabbi Winter, I was sure that was this week's Haftarah. And it's actually Kitisa's Haftarah. So I must have subconsciously been associating them. So I love that. That's great. Thank you. An echo for sure. It's, I think, what Judy Klitzner calls
yes.
Escaping me right now.
Yeah, the title of her book. Yes.
I'll think of it in a second, but or you'll think of it. Someone will think of it, but certainly I think she made it very popular. This idea that I'm going to look it up as we do it. It's going to drive me crazy. She's an amazing teacher and Torah scholar, and she subversive sequels. That's what she does.
That's right.
Subversive sequels, right? So that as her thesis is that as Tanakh continues, that stories come up again and again, but each time there's sort of a different ending, a slightly different ending. My favorite one is the daughters of Lot are are trying to continue the world, so they do it in a sort of yucky incestual way. But that storyline is echoed in the story of Tamar and Yehuda, which is a slightly less yucky incestual story, of just Tamar and her father-in-law as opposed to her father, where she also tries to continue the bloodline, and that subversive sequel ends with the story of Ruth, which has no yucky undertones, where she also feels like she has to continue the bloodline, and her, once the story gets right, it results in the bloodline of David HaMelech. And so, so here it would be interesting to study these two stories. I don't know if she's done it before, that Korach and Moshe have this showdown, and the people have to sort of look between the two and decide, and that then there is this sequel, maybe it's subversive, I don't know, with Eliyahu and the Baal Peor, and that they also have a showdown, and it seems like the people have to choose which direction to go. It's fascinating. I love that. Nelson, were you going to say something before too?
No, I was going to have a couple of thoughts. Was a wonderful description by. My question is, what library did Rabbi Hodi go to? He didn't go to the Library of Congress did he?
Oh, Rav Hodi. He went. There is a copy of this, the whole series of Nechama Leibowitz in the Beit Midrash.
Okay, at Shul.
In the bottom, most bottom shelf on the left of the Aron.
And then I was thinking,
yeah.
When you started the narrative, I thought it must be a reason that we could explain to Korah and to the people. This is the reason you cannot follow Korah. But there was nothing rational. There was just God's authority. I am God, you better believe me, and here is the proof. You open the ground, or you burn, and you're buried. Yeah. So it's my 21st century mind it fights a little bit against that explanation. But in those days, God has to give Moses his authority, and this was the proof. This is the demonstration. That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if
I think you're right. Like Korach presents this compelling argument that might sway some of the people, and Hashem doesn't have a compelling argument back. It's just that Hashem is Hashem.
Yeah.
It's hard. I agree with you.
This argument is everybody is holy. Seems not everybody is equally holy. There is some gradation. God is the source of holiness. Moses receives it from God, and then there is a hierarchy, just like the days of the week. Shabbat is Shabbat. Not every day is Shabbat. You have to separate and to make Shabbat holy. So here.
That's beautiful. Kibad blue. Yeah. I like that. I think it's reflected in that language, of like separate yourselves. Kibad blue, Havdalah. Yeah. That's nice, Nelson. Okay.
Well, I was jealous that you have all this opportunity and go and learn all those sources. And at least you got to share.
Yeah, it was, well, that's when I realized that there was a page that was out of order. I had already done like the first 50%. And I thought, well, I already tracked down all these sources in Hebrew, and they're so interesting. And I'd already looked at the story of Achan, and I like this question of, our responsibility levels. And that's why Rav Hodi really saved me. And I thought I was going a little bit crazy because the page numbers were in order. I don't know, Rabbi Winter, I don't know what's on page 198 of your Sefer. I wonder if it's the old version has the mistake. Does the top of page 198 say Korach 4 or Korach 3?
It doesn't say at the top. It just says, the title, the Israelites' role in the Korach mutiny, and that's it. And it gives a quotation of one of the verses. there is, I think it's on 200, I have a 201, on page 201 at the bottom. It says, what was the purpose of the divine demand to?
And then it just it leaves off, right?
And the next page, if we go to
the
number
note.
2, in the
Yeah. So it's
continuation
very,
of thoughts, questions for further study.
yes.
But it's really, it doesn't pick up, the question we get on the top of the next page of 202 is number 2.
That's right.
So,
It's
yeah, I don't know
amazing.
how old
It's a
mine.
huge mistake. Well, so now you have the corrected version in this in the doc that Karen sent out, because I had to, yes, that was my other clue that I was missing something.
Mine is copyrighted 1980.
So that's the one that I have online, but Rav Hodi, the one at the shul is the new studies. It's the off-white cover instead of the
Ah, yes.
when
Yes.
I saw your cover, I thought it might have you. So it's not a problem of the digital copy, it's a problem of that Sefer. Wow, what a mistake. That's crazy. I've never read a book so carefully as I've read this book, because as I transcribe things back and forth, I've kept track of like a few notes, but they're usually corrected by the new studies version. So just little things, like a citation here or there. Yeah, Judith. I almost texted you, Judith, because I knew you had the book. Oh, you're muted though. You're muted.
Well, we go.
We don't hear you. You're muted.
That's
I wonder how that happened. Okay. Just thinking about the question of God being so aggressively certain without having to make an explanation of the difference between Moses and Korach. I think I can empathize with that. Just Lahavdil, in comparison to our attempts to size up political candidates
Yeah.
during before the election. I'm thinking of local candidates here
Hmm.
for local office. And I remember watching a video where each of the candidates, presented themselves, and there were questions, moderators. And I wound up being swayed that the one who seemed most attractive and articulate and, saying all the right things about what he wanted to accomplish seemed to me much less concerned with representing the interests of his constituents. And eventually, some things came out of his mouth that just confirmed for me that he was in this as a stepping stone to higher office and really wanted the power to implement what he thought was the right thing to do for the community and the state, and was overlooking what the office for which he was running actually required, which was to take care of the people in his constituency. I think that's really the sense we get from Korach. He's questioning Moses and Aaron for what he perceives as their taking over power, leadership, and why can't they share it with other people? When, from God's point of view, presumably, God is drawn to Moses because Moses is a channel. In other words, Moses doesn't lust for power, he lusts for solutions for his people, and is willing to humble himself. In other words, not put what's the word I'm looking for? Ego interests in the way of his transmitting God's will into action of some kind, which is presumably why he's known as the most humble of human beings, not because he's bowing down on a carpet, but because he doesn't put himself in between God and God's will for, putting it into human actions. A little hard to describe.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
li-
I mean, oh, go ahead,
You know,
Nelson.
it's like parenthood. I think we all have to learn this difference when we become parents and have to think about the interests of the child and just submerging our other impulses,
Hmm.
feeling good about doing it when we're actually giving up the agenda we had for ourselves.
Hmm. I think that both you and Nelson, right, are bringing up that it's hard to know where to stand, right? If the question is like, were we standing too close to Korach? It's hard to know where to stand when we don't get to hear both sides, right? When we don't get to hear both arguments, and when the arguments are not really clear, and we don't always understand the motives of the person arguing, right? In hindsight, we can clearly say Korach was the bad guy, and right, God has sort of solved that, but like the world does not work that way anymore. And so even in hindsight, we don't always know if we've made the right choice. But it is very hard. I don't think that any commentary took it lightly, right? It wasn't like B'nai Israel obviously should have done X, Y, or Z, but that once we figure it out, we have to make sure to distance ourselves, both physically and spiritually, but it's very hard to figure out.
No, I think Judy touched the most important thing, which is the humbleness of Moshe. It always
Mm,
Moses, my humble servant. He says that in the Tanakh several times. And Korach was just the opposite, the arrogance or arrogance.
mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm.
there's maybe a simplification, but that was it. I have another association that I have about this whole thing. I always get impressed by there's the number of Tehillim, number of psalms that are
Mm,
the sons of Korah. So
yeah.
Korah's sin did not go through the next generation. So
Mhm.
we still sing the songs of uh, the psalms by the sons of Korah.
Yeah,
So,
it's such a fascinating thing. There is a wild Gemara. I don't have the citation, but I'll try to get it for you guys. About a rabbi or a traveler who's walking down the road, and there was a crack in the street, and there was like, I think there was like steam or vapor coming out of the crack, and he stood to listen, and he could hear the B'nai Korach, is the way the Gemara understood it, singing these Tehillim from the sort of the middle. Right, the Gemara is saying like they weren't totally unscathed by this episode, but they also weren't sent down all the way to the ground wherever Korach got swallowed into. But it is you're right, the Tehillim written by B'nai Korach is an interesting thing, and thinking about sort of how far our own choices extend down the generations. I'll see if I can find that Gemara. It was crazy. Okay, this was such an amazing chapter to learn all together. Before I forget, I will say I'm preparing for next year and thinking about our new theme. If anyone has like a burning thing they want to explore in the Parsha, please feel free to send me an email. I am leaning towards picking a mitzvah that comes from each Parsha and exploring that each week, one mitzvah a week. But if you are like, no, I really want to learn the Ibn Ezra each week, let me know. Maybe I'll change my mind. I would love to learn something that's of interest to everybody. So that's what's on my mind. Nothing big happening in the world of Skokie Valley. In the world, lots of big things. May it be a peaceful and quiet week. And I look forward to seeing you next week. An early
Thank
Shabbat
you very
Shalom.
much. This was a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you.